Latinx. A person of Latin American origin or descent, used as a gender-neutral or non-binary alternative to Latino or Latina.
Latinx. We're black, we're brown, we're white. We're immigrants, we break binaries and cross borders. We speak all languages and are of all abilities, faiths, spiritualities, sizes, gender identities, sexual orientations, and documentation statuses, and we're here to stay.
I'm Alejandra.
I'm Ana.
This is Latinx Mental Health Podcast, where we talk to therapists, researchers, artists, activists, and students about their experiences in the intersections of mental health and Latinx identity. In each interview, we aim to connect through our voices, our struggles, and our triumphs, as we sample a different herbal tea, just like Abuela used to make.
For this episode, we spoke with Dr. Laurie Cook Heffron, a social work professor at St. Edward's University. We drank Revitalise tea, a blend of rosehip, hibiscus, and cherry, and talked about social work research, making space for all voices in teaching and organizing, and social workers' roles in writing letters for immigration cases.
The Latinx Mental Health Podcast is not a substitute for professional mental health care. We encourage you to seek resources and support in your community. Hi, it's good to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so we're just going to jump right in with the first question. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you became a social worker?
I grew up not knowing any social workers, not knowing what social work was. I didn't really have a frame of reference for the discipline or the profession at all. I studied linguistics and Spanish in college and was really interested in exploring the world. I had a lot of privilege related to being able to move around the world, in and out of the United States and different places. And so when I finished undergrad, I lived in West Africa for a couple of years and worked in child and maternal health. And interacted with folks who were doing public health, which started to be of interest to me. But the more I thought about public health, the more I worried about feeling like I was involved in something that was prescriptive, sort of prescribing shoulds and things like that. And I really started to think about sociology or anthropology because I was really curious about the world and really just wanted to learn. But I had this other piece of me that also wanted to do something that was applied, that was action-oriented. So eventually I moved back to the United States and I worked in sort of a public health setting. But my boss was a social worker. And I started to learn a little bit more about what that meant. And then fairly impulsively, I went to graduate school and got an MSW without really knowing what social work was. So mostly I just got lucky because once I got into the graduate program, I realized that it exactly was what I was hoping for. It was this sort of idea of learning and understanding about the world and these nested systems that we talk about. We talk about the socioecological model with this applied piece.
Right.
We've heard that from a few of our guests, like people hadn't really considered social work and they went into one field kind of not knowing, and then they found out about social work and it was like this blend of all the things that they wanted to do. So that's like one of the neat things about being a social worker, just how flexible it is.
Yeah, and that's definitely my experience too.
Yeah, mine too.
I don't know that everyone fully knows all the things a social worker can do, but we kind of make our way into it. And then I think that's what's neat is you can make out of it what you want and kind of bring your strengths to it too. That's so neat. So what was your trajectory then from the MSW to the PhD?
So upon completing my MSW, I worked in the legislature for a little while. I was interested in social welfare and social services related policy. And I worked in the legislature doing that work. Really, that was in the post-welfare reform days, and it was also in the early days after the Olmstead Act when Texas was struggling with how to address the large-scale institutionalization of people with disabilities. And that was really interesting work. However, my boss at the time lost the chairmanship position when some of the power in the Texas House of Representatives shifted. And I was offered a job back at the School of Social Work at UT, where I had been doing my MSW. and got involved as I had what I still consider in some ways a dream job, someone that was in the MSW program with me, and I job shared 2 different positions. So we had a research position that was looking at both intimate partner violence and sexual violence, but also research related to immigrants and refugees. And then we shared a social work case manager position working with resettled refugees in the Austin area.
Oh, wow.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that does sound like a dream job.
So we got to both do the very applied sort of micro and meso level work, in addition to being involved with research, which we both enjoyed, and we had each other to bounce ideas off of and work together and learn from.
That's so awesome. I love that. And so being back at UT, that kind of led you into this idea of maybe going back to academia and the PhD and kind of learning and researching more?
Eventually, I did that job sharing for several years, and then I eventually moved into just a research position for several more years before I decided to go back into the doctoral program.
Awesome.
And that research began to look more at was more heavily involved with intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and then at that time, this was shortly after the Trafficking Victims Protection Act passed in 2000, and our community and many other communities were trying to figure out what that meant for our communities, and so some of that work also began to look at exploitation, particularly as it related to immigrant communities.
So being a researcher at the School of Social Work, I think, is an interesting position given that there is such a focus on applying social work. So I'm curious to know your thoughts on what makes social work research in particular unique, or how you think about what social work research is.
I do think social work research is unique or has the potential to be unique. I think one of the strengths it can offer is exactly what you just said, is blending the search for greater understanding, greater perspectives or multiple perspectives, voices that perhaps haven't been heard, valuing and recognizing the lived experience of a number of folks, valuing and recognizing different kinds of knowledge, and that plus the applied part of it. So research that has an aim, research that's aimed to speak into improvement of social service programs and networks and things like that. I think sort of the combination of those 2 things is both what attracted me to social work, but also to social work research. In addition, I think social work research at least has some part of a history in community-based research, in asking communities what they want to know more about, asking communities what they want, what kind of evidence they want documented. So I think it's a struggle, though, in all honesty, because I think as social work gains its own identity or struggles with its own identity as a profession, it also comes up against the pressure from funders and from other disciplines to do different kinds of research that perhaps is less community-based.
Yeah.
Yeah, sort of defining itself as a social science and what that looks like.
Exactly.
Yeah. Backtracking just a little bit, would you talk in more depth and detail about your dissertation?
So my dissertation looked at the intersections of migration and intimate partner violence and sexual violence. And in particular, during those years that I was both working with the immigrant refugee community, but also working around research, but also community social services and supports across the state of Texas related to sexual violence and intimate partner violence, I began to hear more and more from folks, particularly from folks working in rape crisis centers across the state, that they were beginning to feel the impact of some sort of new trends in migration, right, that had been happening for many years, but the growing numbers of women or women and children who are migrating to Texas from Central America, from Guatemala or El Salvador or Honduras, and began hearing from providers who maybe felt that they had developed good practices and good relationships with the Mexican-American community and the Mexican immigrant community, but who were seeing like new immigrant communities that they felt like maybe they weren't reaching as well, or the services didn't sort of land like they thought they would, things like that. So through that other work, I began hearing that and seeing that. And at this time, also, this is sort of to 2010-ish, we were beginning to hear more about just growing numbers of folks migrating to the U.S. from those 3 countries in Central America.
Yeah, I think it would surprise some people to think that, if you're working with like the Mexican American and the Mexican community, that there would be these differences between communities in Central America. So I think people would be interested in hearing like what some of those differences were.
So I think one of the things that I was hearing at the time was just a real concern for the level of social isolation that folks from other countries perhaps were experiencing in the communities. So, that's also a really layered thing, as we know, related to perhaps undocumented status, but also perhaps a smaller community, perhaps a community that has a less long-term sort of presence in a city or rural as well. So I think the social isolation part was one of the things that sort of rose to the surface. In addition, I think I heard many rape crisis center services across the state and services for domestic violence survivors as well rely on group work.
Right.
And so they were beginning to see perhaps conflicts within groups or folks who didn't want to attend group, who had all kinds of reasons for whether or not they felt safe or welcome in other kinds of groups. The other thing that I think we began noticing, and many people noticing this, of course, is that in terms of sort of my role as an academic or as a researcher, the literature base, which we always like to refer to as like this iconic thing, right? Was faulty, of course, right? In part because I think there was beginning to be a good deal of research out there about risks of and impact of intimate partner violence or domestic violence on immigrant women in the U.S. when that happened to folks after arriving in the U.S. And perhaps particular risks or vulnerabilities to folks. But there wasn't a lot of work done, at least not in the research literature. There was beginning to be media reports and reports from advocacy groups about the other risks of exploitation and or of interpersonal violence that Central American women in particular faced as they crossed multiple borders to the U.S. And as militarization of the borders increased and enforcement increased and those pathways that people used to travel to the U.S. became smaller and more narrow, the risk and vulnerability to sexual violence in particular seemed to be rising. And so part of my reason for focusing on all of that with my dissertation research was hoping to gather information both from folks who'd experienced them themselves, but also from service providers and or other advocates working in that space, and finding a way to translate that or bridge that into the provider community and into the educational system in terms of how we educate social workers to go out and into their practices and have a broader understanding of migration in general and compounded trauma, perhaps. But also the tremendous strengths that in decision-making people use when they're navigating risky situations or precarious situations, or when they're navigating the layers of oppressive systems that face them and how they move in and out of those.
Yeah, I think, like you mentioned, a lot of people might think of, especially being in Texas and this context, that a lot of people who are immigrants are from Mexico. And so I do think that there's been a little bit more increase in a focus on Central America recently, partly because of work like yours and kind of the other people who have been talking about this now. But I think there was still a lot of surprise sometime last year when there were those news reports about like discrimination against Central Americans from folks in Mexico. And so some of those nuances I think are so important to think about. And I know that when I've interacted with some of our local shelters here, there's still been some conversations about how, you can't just throw everyone who speaks Spanish in a group together and expect the group dynamics to like go super smoothly. So that is an interesting thing that I think is still something that we're working on, right? As a system of people trying to support folks.
Yeah, and as Mexico becomes more of a receiving country and as people are getting stuck in Mexico, this sort of research becomes more important because a lot of people don't understand that context, right? Like what happens when they get to Mexico? What happens when they get stuck in Mexico and they try to come over? And what is that impact on the communities there? What is the impact on the communities here?
I think that we've talked to several people on the podcast that kind of do a really cool job of combining micro, meso, macro work. And I'm interested to hear more about what you're doing now, because I think being at a university, and also I know that you work with some students in their field placements. And so I'm curious to kind of talk about how you're combining research, practice, teaching, all in one role as a social worker.
Well, I have transitioned out of a sort of research-focused academic position into a smaller liberal arts university. So I work at St. Edward's University now. So my plate is divided differently than it used to be, and research takes up a smaller portion of the plate. But in some ways, a really fulfilling portion, perhaps, because I find that being in a smaller university that doesn't focus on research necessarily allows me to be very sort of selective about how I want to spend my time in general, but being thoughtful and intentional about small research projects, qualitative projects that I can spend more time with because they are more time-consuming, perhaps. So I do a little bit of research still related to the same issues and related to access to services for undocumented immigrant survivors in Texas. And when I say survivors, I'm usually referring to survivors of intimate partner violence or sexual violence or exploitation. But also my primary role now is as an educator. So I teach social work courses, and until this last year was also the director of our field education program. So I coordinated field placements for our undergraduate social work students, which I loved doing because it helped me stay connected with the community of providers in this region. And also watching students apply what they've been thinking about and learning about either through books and classroom setting into real world settings, as y'all know, because you've also done field internships, is so exciting. To see folks really embrace the things they've learned or come up against the things they've learned and begin to challenge what they were learning and push back against things in really important ways. But one of the ways I think actually that I have really enjoyed being at a small liberal arts university and one whose mission includes social justice is that outside of the class, but on campus, I can find ways to do that. So simply as one example, last week I held a university-wide event that was targeted at my class. I'm teaching a class on social welfare policy, and we were talking about immigration and immigration policies. But then I opened it up and held it in a larger space for other students to attend as well. And this event was, the aim at least, was to think about immigration detention and responses or solutions to immigration detention from various perspectives. And so this is where sort of the connection back to the community came in for me, at least, because we had Claudia Munoz, who's the executive co-director of Grassroots Leadership, come talk about the organizing perspective and what the organizing perspective thinks about and does related to immigration detention. Dr. Gabby Hurtado Alvarado from Prickly Pear Therapy, who's a licensed psychologist, talked about the mental health sort of perspective and trauma. And then Alyssa Steglich from the University of Texas Immigration Law Clinic came to talk about the legal perspective.
Nice.
So that was a nice conversation to hear how each of those sort of approaches builds off one another, but also the ways in which they perhaps are in conflict.
So how have you been able to apply some of your past experiences you've been talking about in research and in social work practice in your current role and at, like you were saying, the university that you're at?
Having been trained up as a researcher and really focused on research in the academic context, and then moving into a teaching and sort of more of an educator role, I've had to shed a lot of my old ways, and I was noticing it in myself during the event the other day because as the panelists themselves would talk, I had a lot that I was thinking about. I had a lot that I thought maybe I could share. I had a lot of, my own research or having really delved into the research of many, many other scholars that I felt like applied. And so part of my role, I think right now, is knowing when and how to step back, knowing when and how to quiet my own voice, which has taken up plenty of space over time already, and learning when to make space for other voices, which was part of my rationale for having the event in the first place. But then in the moment and in practice, really being cognizant of my own instinct to jump in and to add. And I think that kind of goes to, in general, this conflict that I think that many people perhaps face, which is being academia will train you, and many other fields will too, to self-promote, to credit yourself, to be the first author, to put to publish, right? And that's part of the machine. It's part of the profession and the work. It's part of how people continue to get research grants that continue to allow them to have a job, and to continue to promote their institutions where they work. And that goes up directly against, I think, some of our values in social work and maybe some of my own values and just my instinct that as a person who is not Latina, who is not a survivor of intimate partner violence, who has not experienced immigration detention, who has had incredible and unearned advantages in my life, to step back, to make space, to move away, right? So those things, I think, are a struggle for lots of folks because they come in contact with each other. The professional pressure to push yourself forward, and then maybe the social work or social justice value in stepping back, stepping away, moving to the margins to allow others to be centered.
Yeah. One of the, so I'm a really big fan of group therapy, and have done some trainings with the Austin Group Psychotherapy Society. And I remember at like some of the trainings, they talk a lot about this concept of like step up, step back, right? So I think that's what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
It takes that sort of self-awareness, like, oh, I know I'm a person who likes to share. Like I sometimes have a hard time sharing, so kind of pushing myself to like speak, and that we all kind of hold that responsibility in group work at least, which is I think something that can be translated really beautifully when we talk about organizing.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And I think that shows up in interesting ways in the classroom as well, because I think, for so many of us in classrooms, we might have a participation grade and an engagement grade that really is all about how much you talk in class, and really trying to, one of the things I've learned is that the more opportunities and diverse opportunities I give for students to talk about what they understand, what they think, right, how they are interacting with a text or reading or whatnot, in writing, after some time to think about it, after discussion, before discussion, out loud in their head, right? The more, and it's just so exciting because you really see all the different ways that we all feel comfortable sharing what we think and how important it is. In group practice, it does necessitate that verbal engagement.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big group therapy nerd, so.
Yeah, I love group work too, a lot. And I appreciate that too, because I think not enough professors pay attention to that, to giving diverse opportunities, to knowing that there's different people in the room who have different reasons to feel that they can or can't take up space because of how they've been socialized or how the world has received them or what have you. And so I think, when I think about like teaching methods, one of those pieces is like, can we have small group discussion and big group discussion and individual ways to be in touch with the professor and so many different ways of engaging people? Should we get up and move around? Like, and I think that's really, really important when we think about how we all communicate differently. And then you can also kind of model self-awareness for students, right?
Yeah. And I think language is part of that too. When I think about sometimes what I'll do is give folks a 2-minute like quiet free write that they don't have to turn in, low expectations before a group, small or large group discussion. And I wonder if that plays into y'all's experiences with group. If there's somebody, for example, for whom the language doesn't come as easily for whatever reason, having a chance to think quietly and put their thoughts together before then feeling like they're on the spot to share them.
I love that. That's awesome because it helps everyone. That's kind of the thing that we've talked about with like, I know this isn't an exact parallel, but we've talked about this with disability too. And the idea that like, if you do something that benefits a person who might like just need more time or space or what have you, it's not going to harm anyone. And in fact, it benefits everyone. So like me as someone who is almost always ready with something to say, it will also be a good thing for me to organize my thoughts for 2 minutes on paper. And I will probably also like be more eloquent if I do that, right? Rather than just jumping in and being excited, which I am and I do, and also have worked on. But I think that like that's one of those ideas of like if we do something that is definitely going to benefit someone who might like struggle more in that context for whatever reason, like you said, it's also going to benefit everyone else. So why not do it?
Yeah, and I think we can do a better job as like not just as social workers, but like now we're talking about organizing.
Yeah.
As organizers in these big spaces, in these social justice spaces, because it's like this ideology that we have, right? Like we talk about like not taking up too much space as white people or as letting people, people who are marginalized have a voice. But we don't talk about like, well, how do we do that?
Right.
Because it's easy to say it.
Right.
But then like if, in a moment of silence, people are very uncomfortable. And like, if you have come from a place where you've been silent, it isn't easy to go up there and speak. And you don't want to force somebody to speak either. So how can we be more intentional? How can we help people get their voice and their message across without sort of like pushing people to the front, right?
Right. Right.
So I think we could have like a whole conversation just about that, because I don't know.
We probably will.
Yeah, we probably will. I mean, this is part of it. So
Yeah, I feel like every episode too, we're sort of I think we touch on themes every time, and so over time, I think we're piecing together like different ideas and perspectives. But I agree, right? Like how can we conceptualize spaces that have enough of those opportunities for everyone to contribute in the ways that they want to. Because I'm also thinking about, like the person who's really good at art and like wants to contribute that way, or wants to write a song, or wants to, again, like maybe be in the strategizing, but not stand in front of 1,000 people and talk or whatever. And if you can, I think it just takes that self-awareness of what you have to contribute, right? And then also of being able to kind of learn from other people and what they have to contribute, and then making space for everyone all together.
and that's just like a different level of organizing.
It is. And it's slower. I think that's the other piece. Like in like some of what I think we can bring to organizing from social work is this idea of like in therapy of like slowing down, of taking more time, of being intentional. And that I think sometimes with organizing, everything feels kind of like crisis mode, and, we have to go. And in some ways that makes sense, right? Depending on what you're working on. But I think there's also a lot of advantages to knowing that there's kind of a long game to be played, and that slowing down kind of helps include everyone, maybe not burn out as easily, and actually over time build up, right, together.
I think it also allows time to pay attention to agency and people's decision making about how and when they participate. Because I think an interesting dilemma in the field right now, I think, is that particularly when we think about, just in thinking about immigration detention and folks who are detained, I think some folks, and maybe oftentimes mental health professionals, will feel protective of folks they've worked with who've been detained and not want them to feel pressure to engage in social advocacy stuff, go to the public, right, be a speaker at an event, those kinds of things. And then on the other side, I think I hear organizers talking about respecting people's agency and decision making, and that people have the ability to say yes or no. And I think that's a kind of an interesting tension.
Yes.
And how and when are people being exploited versus making their own decisions, and how much information do people have about what's going to happen in a social action or some kind of organizing campaign. And maybe with slowing down, we can sort through that a little bit more easily.
Yeah. It's time to refill our cups. Join us at the table for a nice chat and a cup of tea in a part of the episode we call the sobremesa. Hey, Ali.
Hey,
How's it going?
swell. Never better. Living the dream.
Yes. Today for our sobremesa, we wanted to give some updates on what we've been up to, and also think about the future season 3, what we've got going on with the podcast, and some upcoming opportunities for y'all to get involved. So tell us, what's new with you?
Well, what is new with me? I got a job yesterday.
Pause for applause. Woo.
And yeah, I'm not really at a point where I want to share what that is, but it's been a long time coming. I've been unemployed for a while now. So it's really good timing. I'm really excited. It's, something I didn't think I was going to be able to do.
Yeah.
So I've got a job, and just doing the health stuff Lots of doctor's appointments, thinking a lot about disability justice.
Yes.
Trying to find my niche in there, and definitely wanting to build more of a community around that and be more open to sharing some of the trials and tribulations. I think I've reached that point. I felt very closed off for a long time. Yeah.
Awesome. I'm excited to see what that looks like.
Me too. What about you?
Well, I have some exciting news too.
You do?
So Leo, who y'all may know, is our audio engineer, and he and I have been together for over 9 years now. And this past weekend, we got engaged. Woo! Pause for applause. Woo! So yes, we're super excited, and it's been a little bit of a whirlwind, but it's also been a long time coming.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just really nice to be able to experience that and receive a lot of love from different people who support us, and just be able to see a very exciting future. So
Another thing is that we have been doing this podcast for a year now.
yes, we're recording this on our 1-year anniversary of launching on Facebook.
It's February 19th.
So we want to definitely thank everyone who has supported us in this journey, and all of you who have listened to our episodes and been able to be a part of this broader community that we're trying to build around the intersection of mental health and Latinx identity. And thanks to everyone who's subscribed, who's liked the podcast. If you haven't done that yet, please feel free to go do so on social media, on podcast platforms, and really start building out some of those reviews. If you wouldn't mind going and giving us some stars and reviews, that's something that can really help the podcast as we look toward growth in this 3rd season.
Yeah, reviews are how people find podcasts, so that would be super helpful. And I think another thing that we really want to focus on this season is having more input from the community and reaching out more into like the actual community outside of the confines of the recording, like actually go out into the community. And another way that you can get involved is if you think that you have an interesting story or you want to be a guest on the podcast, you can email us at latinxmhpodcast@gmail.com. Give us an idea of what it is you want to talk about, and we'll reach back out. And you can also message us on Facebook, or even send us a comment on Instagram or message on Instagram. Anywhere where that we post, you can get a hold of us, and we'll reach back out to you. And we really look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah. And last but not least, we are planning another one of our now annual podcast fundraisers and celebrations for the end of the spring. So stay on the lookout for more information to come with details and information about the event and other ways that you can help support the podcast.
We're still trying to raise money for our equipment, and a big priority of mine is that we can finally get some transcription going to make our show more inclusive. But that all takes money. So yeah, stay tuned. Thank you.
Awesome. Now back to the interview.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you started writing these assessment letters? What led to that?
So with the research I was doing that was related to the multiple ways that violence impacts people's migration decision-making, which was part of my research and then continued on, shortly after that, as I was embedded in that work, was also during the time that detention began to expand. At the same time, I was continuing to do research related to the way violence plays a part in people's migration decision-making across time and across space. I was also working in an institute that trained up professionals and advocates to serve as expert witnesses in criminal court related to domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And so I had been a part of putting those trainings on and learning from them, but not having ever served as an expert witness in those capacities. That wasn't my work or my role. At any rate, at that time, those two worlds began to combine. And so I began to get requests from folks who were working with women who were seeking asylum based on domestic violence. And this is back before that became a harder route for asylum seekers, asking if I could serve as an expert witness to help the court understand that what this person's experience was met what the literature says, or what the research says, or what the practice wisdom says about domestic violence, right? And serve as just one more voice in this case to help the court understand. And so I did that a couple of times, and then in 2014, we initiated family detention in the Texas centers in Karnes City and in Dilley opened. And at that time, the folks that were in the Karnes City detention facility were women and their children. They were all asylum seekers. They were primarily from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And they were being detained for 9, 10, 12 months. And so I was contacted by an immigration attorney who was trying to make the case that because people's past experiences of violence or abuse or trauma, they should be allowed bond and they should be allowed to be released from detention. And so my first experience doing this kind of work wasn't so much with letters, but was rather trying to help make the argument from the social science literature and from the mental health background that detention would be a negative impact on someone who is a survivor of trauma, right? It sounds silly a little bit to say that now because it feels very obvious.
Right.
But these arguments were being asked to be made.
And they still are.
And they still are, right?
Yeah.
It's very important work.
So that was an interesting time for me because I was someone who was coming out of a doctoral program who was suffering from imposter syndrome like we all do and trying to decide what knowledge I had, where it fit, where it didn't fit. And it was sort of an opportunity for me to think, my own training and education, my own social work practice experience, and my own original research now can play a role in this other way.
Yeah.
So I started in that way in terms of letters, which were really more like declarations, where I brought both some level of assessment of someone, having done an interview with them, together with the research literature that I understood or that I knew about. And then that grew into working with a much larger number of cases that were domestic violence-based asylum or T visas or U visas, writing both written testimony after interviewing applicants and then sometimes providing oral testimony in court. So it's a little bit different than the letter writing, perhaps, that you're talking about in terms of a provider writing a letter that may say, this person received services from my organization, or maybe a longer, more comprehensive psychosocial evaluation that a clinical social worker could do.
Does it serve a different purpose? Is it viewed differently in court? Or if somebody were to come with like what you wrote or a letter from like a LCSW, would they be viewed similarly, or?
I think they serve different purposes.
Okay.
So sometimes I'll work on a case where there might be a clinician who's written a letter and or who's included diagnoses and has used validated scales and measures and whatnot. And then my report will come alongside. And so oftentimes in my report, I will interview someone and I will make some remarks perhaps about the experiences or the behaviors or the symptoms they report that also might be consistent, for example, with depression or anxiety. But I'm not a clinician, and so I won't make diagnoses around that. But really, my report, I think, is more around setting the stage for what the literature says about this thing, right? Whether it be human trafficking as it affects the LGBT community of immigrants or whatnot,
right? Yeah.
Which is not my area of expertise, so I wouldn't write one of those letters. But right, so I might try to set the stage for what the literature says about it, and then describe the person's experience and connect those two as
so
a way,
like an expert witness.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So this person's experience meets what we know in the research literature, but also perhaps in my social work background or of being a practitioner, this matches with what we know.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about what social workers can bring to the table because I think it can be daunting to think about being involved in a legal case. I think that can feel like a really big deal. But I like the idea that we can emphasize the expertise that we do bring and that we can recognize that as mental health professionals or as social workers or researchers, there is something unique and particular about that knowledge base and that can be brought forward. And especially in the ways I've seen it where a lot of judges aren't trained in understanding trauma. And so some things, like you said earlier, that just seem really basic to us, like detaining children for 9 months is not good for their mental health. Like, that seems very basic, right? But in a lot of ways, things that seem kind of obvious might actually not be to everyone. And so how we can use our particular training and knowledge in those contexts, to me, is really amazing and part of that social justice advocacy piece, right? Even when it's a very clinically focused type of letter. So as we've talked about sort of blending like micro and macro, I think that's a really beautiful union of the two. Yeah. So is there anything that you kind of thinking about that potentially feeling daunting to folks? Is there anything that you would like to share with other social workers or mental health professionals that might be interested in writing letters?
I agree that it can feel daunting, especially some of the work that may require you to give oral testimony might feel particularly daunting, sitting in a courtroom and responding to a judge. However, I think, to me, I think some of the most important pieces are finding other folks who are doing it, who will want to be in conversation with you about what it's like, what it is, what has helped them. So really finding social support and building a network of other folks that you can bounce ideas off of is hugely important. I also think being really aware of your own expertise has been something I've had to make sure I pay a lot of attention to. Because I think if we're drawn to social justice issues, we really want to make a difference or make a change. We also might be tempted to work beyond our own expertise and skill, right? And so just knowing that that pressure is there and being really honest with yourself about where your expertise ends, which is also hard because so many of us also, as I mentioned before, this whole idea of imposter syndrome or downplaying your own expertise.
Right.
And so you have to be, I think, really careful about owning your own expertise.
I would guess especially in front of a judge.
Yeah, right. So I think building sort of a network of support and or mentorship or guidance, really self-aware about your own, what you have to offer and how you can offer it. And then building relationships. So I think one of the harder parts perhaps is that most mental health professionals or researchers, whether they're writing a letter or serving as an expert witness, have never been trained to do that. And so they don't really know what they're doing, perhaps, or what they're getting into, and they don't have a structure, a framework to think about it in. And likewise, oftentimes the folks that are requesting that, the attorney, has also not been trained in what they're asking for.
Right.
And so it's sort of meeting in the middle somewhere and having really good communication about that and building a relationship between those two parties, I think can help it go more smoothly.
Definitely.
Wow, this is all really heavy stuff that you read on a daily basis, like this research. These are heavy topics, and I'm sure it comes into your day-to-day life. How do you take care of yourself?
I think over time, when I look back and reflect on how I don't know that it's been very intentional, but when I reflect back and look at how I've taken care of myself, two main things come to mind. First is getting my hands in the dirt, like literally. I like to garden. I like to look at really tiny things. Like I like, oftentimes we think about these big issues or the policy and all the impact of the policies we currently have on folks who've experienced tremendous pain in their lives and suffering. It just feels really big. And so, I do things like I really, really like caterpillars, and not just for the cliche reason of that butterflies are the symbol of migration, but but I like to plant herbs that attract the swallowtail caterpillars, and I like to plant things that attract the monarchs too, but that's a little harder because milkweed's hard to grow.
Yeah, milkweed's really, really hard.
Yes.
There's like whole classes just on how to not kill your milkweed.
That's right, there are. And then I like to go every day and just look and see if I can find the tiniest ever caterpillar and then watch them get bigger. And, so that's one of the things that I think, that gets you outside and it gets your hands doing something. It gets you focused on something else that's entirely different. And then I think the other thing is gratitude. And that also feels really cliche because I think a lot of people talk about gratitude practice when they talk about wellness or self-care.
That's because it works.
Exactly. So one of the things I do is I, when I start to feel overwhelmed by, how this feels insurmountable, right? How are we ever going to move to a place where people's mobility around the world is respected and valued and protected as a right and whatnot? I literally go through a thought exercise of calling to mind all the amazing people that I know that are doing really good work. And sometimes this sounds ridiculous, but sometimes I sort of fantasize, and I even plan, although I've never done it, of like having a party. Like, what if I had a party and I brought all the people that whose work I just admire so much together in one place? And they...
Maybe.
But oftentimes I'm usually just like writing an email, like, thank you for the work you do or whatever, or trying to be, maintain those relationships with folks. So
was it Mr. Rogers who said to look for the helpers?
yeah.
Oh, Mr. Rogers.
Always bringing Mr. Rogers.
Always bringing Mr. Rogers. And then I think I'm a mother, and I think that just sort of automatically grounds me because not so much anymore. My children are quite independent and self-sufficient, but when they were smaller people and needed me more for their physical survival, walking into a home where there's a toddler, like that just draws your attention immediately to their world and their experience and whatever's happening in that moment for them. Just my relationship with my own family too has been something that I focus on. And
well, that brings us to our last question, which is Alejandra's favorite question, but I get to ask it today. So what is your favorite herb or tea? And you can give more than one.
Okay, good. I have a hard time choosing when there are many options. I think mint comes to mind. Anything with mint, because it's refreshing, because I also grow it, right? All of that, because I like the way it smells and feels on your, the oils on your hands when you smush the leaves.
Yeah.
I also love hibiscus tea, which I'm drinking today, because it reminds me of the years I spent in child and maternal nutrition in West Africa. Hibiscus tea, actually oftentimes with ginger, was a common drink, although it wasn't cold. It was lukewarm because there wasn't a lot of electricity for refrigerators, but that was sort of the drink of that region where I lived.
I haven't tried those two together. I'll have to try that.
Okay.
Nice. I feel like mint has been such a theme. Almost,
has it?
At least half the people we've asked this question to say mint.
Can't go wrong with mint.
It's a good one.
It's a good one. And there's so many different kinds of mint.
Yeah.
Well, and it's a family, so stuff like lavender, basil, rosemary, that's all in the mint family. So yeah.
See,
still
she
learning
has
as
such
a
cool
gardener.
facts. I just get to learn stuff and drink tea, and basically that's why I'm doing this podcast.
Yeah.
It's for the herbs.
Well,
Herb facts. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We've loved having you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Latinx Mental Health Podcast. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at LatinxMHPod, find us on Facebook and YouTube, and subscribe everywhere you listen to podcasts.
hasta la próxima!